You've just accepted a job as the president of an organization called Our Country, Our Choice. Congratulations! Actually, it's a Chief Executive Officer, CEO. Oh, I'm sorry, the Chief CEO. Thank you for the clarification. CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. Could you provide a quick description of what the organization focuses on? Sure. This organization was founded to unite Americans across party lines. We identified that there are many Americans in both the Republican and Democratic parties who share traditional conservative values and are tired of the divisiveness in the country. They want to end overseas interventions, restore the rule of law, combat criminal activities within the country, secure our borders including our ports and waters, and address issues like illegal immigration, which includes integrity and putting an end to the sexualization of our children. These are our primary focuses where we direct most of our attention and resources. Well, those seem like high priority items to me, and I think our audience would agree. Let me segue from that because it appears that the U.S. Congress prioritizes Israel first, Ukraine second, and America last. What's your response to that? The U.S. Congress primarily focuses on their self-interests, followed by the issues you mentioned. The order of priorities after that depends on how much individuals are financially rewarded for their support. Considering members of the House of Representatives serve for 2 years, they spend over 50% of their time seeking re-election, thus craving funds. They are approached by various entities, such as the pharmaceutical industry or advocates for other countries, offering additional funds to their political action committees in exchange for support in re-election. This mechanism receives a lot of attention and essentially shapes how Washington operates. While the Senate might be somewhat better, it remains greed-driven, perhaps even more so. Although they serve for 6 years and aren't constantly campaigning for re-election, they don't miss opportunities to enrich themselves. One thing you've covered in your commentary on the Ukraine situation over the past couple of years is the incompetence in decision-making within the U.S. State Department. Despite significant financial rewards for the military-industrial complex, there's a lack of competence in deploying weapons effectively to achieve goals. Would you describe this as a racket, or how would you define it? You could definitely use the term racket. I'd start by stating that we lack a national strategy. A comprehensive national strategy involves various aspects like military power, economic development, fostering international commerce and business relations, and much more. Sadly, we don't have such a strategy. Instead, we operate based on loosely defined interests that don't always align with the national interest. For instance, I'd argue that eastern Ukraine doesn't hold a strategic national interest for the U.S. Our primary interest in Ukraine should have been to promote peace and stability, something we've failed to achieve. In the Middle East, there's no interest in cultivating a regional war against Israel, yet we've ignored our true interests and focused on financially or immediately rewarding situations. Presently, the spotlight is on Ukraine, depicting it as a pristine democracy needing protection against the Russians, which I find absurd. There's no leadership in charge, there's no coherent direction in our decision-making. Consequently, we are in significant trouble as a nation. We fail to define our fundamental interests and don't align means with ends. We lack a sense of limitations and overestimate our unlimited resources. Following from your remarks, how much credibility is the United States losing on the world stage? For instance, during Antony Blinken's recent Middle East trip, he was treated differently than a U.S. official might have been treated 20 years ago. Have we lost what we once had as a nation? I believe we've faced significant issues for a long time. Historically, up until World War I, our focus was primarily on building prosperity domestically while pursuing peace abroad. We believed that building a strong economic foundation and fostering an educated, hard-working population would attract admiration from the rest of the world. Our Constitution and founders never intended us to intervene in other nations' affairs. For instance, when Thomas Jefferson suggested supporting the French Revolution under Napoleon, Washington and Hamilton opposed it, stating that nations should focus within their own interests. Our primary interest was to secure the North American continent for English-speaking people and maintain a republic promoting stability and peace, with the Constitution strictly outlining government limitations on the people. This foundation remains unparalleled in human history. Most constitutions are all about the powers of the state. Well, our Constitution describes in great detail what the state may not do to us. We've lost touch with all of that, and by essentially signing on for these wars of intervention, let's go back to Vietnam. We certainly went there under false pretenses and deluded ourselves into believing that we were somehow spreading democracy and a new liberal order, or whatever you want to call it, by killing 2 million Vietnamese. That didn't work out very well, and we lost a lot of credibility as a result of that. We then worked to bring it back, and I think we finally did regain a lot of credibility, particularly in 1991. Not just for military reasons, but for the way we handled it diplomatically and our insistence that this was not a war of conquest. That we were not annexing or holding onto Iraq or anything else. We were simply trying to remove it as a danger to the world's oil concentration and keep the oil flowing. That was it, really. So, as a result, we were in pretty good shape. Then we started this business of intervention after the fall or collapse of the Soviet state system. We began deluding ourselves to believe that we were the indispensable nation, that our rights and values were universal, and they never were and never will be. We lost our respect for other people's countries, other people's national interests, other people's cultures, and way of life. It's been a disaster. America today seems to be very good at running around the world attempting to bludgeon other nations into compliance with the Western liberal order, but at great cost to the proxy nations. You've spoken about this. Look at the devastation of Ukraine. How many Ukrainian young men, in particular, have lost their lives, hundreds of thousands, under the guidance mostly of the United States of America? And my question to you, sir, is Israel now in a similar situation where the U.S. is willing to fight Iran to the last Israeli, for example, just as America wanted to fight Russians to the last Ukrainian? Is that a fair comparison, or is there a similar risk in your view? Well, I think what we've got in Israel, a somewhat different set of circumstances. Israel was founded after the Second World War and came into existence as a state largely because Harry Truman breathed life into it. The rationale at the time was twofold. Number one, the Jews just endured this horrible Holocaust. 6 million were systematically murdered in camps or across Eastern Europe. And then, secondly, because Harry Truman's political advisors told him that if you recognize the independence of the State of Israel, we will have unlimited quantities of money at our disposal for the Democratic Party in perpetuity. It turns out that they were largely correct. Enormous quantities of Jewish money have been poured into various political entities in the United States to maintain this relationship and sustain Israel's stature and influence inside the United States. And that's worked very well. But at this point, we're a little different than we were, say, 20, 30, 40, or 50 years ago. If you go back through Israel's previous campaigns, previous wars, Israel was always restrained by presidents who intervened, as Eisenhower did in 1956 and said, "We're not going to underwrite your conquest of the Suez." In other words, of the Sinai Peninsula. The Israelis had come into the Suez Project along with the British and the French, who were interested in regaining control of the Suez Canal, and Eisenhower threw them out and said no. And the Israelis cannot have the Sinai Peninsula again. In 1967, Lyndon Johnson supported them, but Lyndon Johnson also made it clear that there were limits to how much support he was willing to provide. Finally, you get Richard Nixon in 1973, when the Israelis, initially beaten by the Egyptians and the Syrians, managed to throw them back. The Egyptians were the toughest nut to crack because they had simply crossed the canal and set up a defense. The Israelis had enormous difficulties with that defense, but eventually, they broke through and managed to cross the Suez Canal and come in behind the Egyptians. When that happened, Richard Nixon made it clear that's unacceptable. You're going to have to pull back across the Suez Canal or we won't be able to negotiate an end to this. We might end up at war with, and so the Israelis eventually withdrew and retired back behind the Suez Canal. You know, we got the Camp David Accords and built, at least for the past 50 years, a very good relationship between Egypt and Israel. Well, here we are again, and we're dealing with another Israeli government. Only this time, the government has said we want to finally, once and for all, settle accounts with these Muslim Arabs in Gaza. It's not enough to destroy Hamas. We have to eliminate the foundation for Hamas, and that foundation is the 2.2 million Arabs living inside the Gaza Strip. And no one has stood up and said, I'm sorry, but eliminating the 2.2 million people from this Gaza Strip is unacceptable. We won't underwrite it. We won't support it. That is something that we have opposed repeatedly. We oppose so-called ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We've opposed ethnic cleansing in Africa. How can we now stand up and support what effectively is ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Gaza? So, this is not a crack, because what's different today is that I think Mr. Netanyahu has more influence and authority on the Hill than President Biden. President Biden's government is really lost. They don't seem to know what to do. Every time Blinken opens his mouth and makes some policy pronouncement, President Netanyahu contradicts him and tells him, absolutely not. That's not what we are going to do. Most recently, it was in the event this war ends and Gaza is devoid of Hamas, then we're going to retain control of it. We'll police it. That is the Israelis. And Blinken had previously made a statement that they were looking for a different solution. It would not involve Israeli control of Gaza. So I think it's pretty clear that thanks to the power and influence that Israel has won over many decades through its lobby in Washington, it has paid off. And right now, Mr. Netanyahu's clearly in charge, and this is a very dangerous situation for a great power like the United States. Do we want to be dragged into a potential regional war with virtually everyone in the region? And there are critical questions. I completely agree with that line of reasoning. There are also domestic implications for this. For example, our mutual acquaintance Michael Jan has been covering the wide-open border and how Mayorkas has funded camps in the Darien Gap in Panama, staging areas for an ongoing invasion of the United States. Now, with the U.S. supporting Israel's ongoing bombardment of civilian targets, hospitals, universities, and refugee camps in Gaza, we run the very real risk, and this is what I'd like your response to, of many of the illegals in the United States becoming more activated or more radicalized if they happen to be, let's say, Palestinians or linked to Hamas or something. So, could there be a very real domestic risk of suicide bombers or what have you because of the poorly thought out policies of the way the U.S. State Department is interacting with Israel? Well, I think the answers to your questions are yes and yes. First of all, we don't even know who's inside the United States. We have no idea how many illegals are really here. I've spoken to a couple of people who have to remain anonymous for obvious reasons over at Homeland Security, and I asked specifically, the numbers that have been published say that we might have 8 million illegals in the country, and they began laughing. Right. They said, are you kidding? And I said, no. This is what's out. They said, well, we've got at least 28 million, probably more, and went on to explain that 7 or 8 million have come across the borders since Biden became president. Remember that most of the people you're talking about that we see on television are the people that we've caught, at least insofar as we've apprehended them and noted them, at least who they say they are, registered them, handed them a check for $2,350, and then a free ticket to wherever they want to go in. The United States. Yes. But we don't know who they are. We don't know what they think. And it's very clear that no one in Washington particularly cares. This whole notion of assimilation, which was really designed to be Americanization, has been thrown out. So, no one has to assimilate. No one is going to be seriously interrogated about their origins and their connections and their beliefs. This is what's happened to us. So we're really on a suicidal path ourselves, but it's a different kind of suicide. It's assisted suicide with the government assisting people to destroy us by overwhelming us internally with foreigners. And I would argue that this is going to become a real issue once we go into a severe recession or worse into a depression, which more and more people think is possible. Yes, so we may systematically disintegrate ourselves as a great power because we have no social cohesion, because we can't impose the rule of law, because we can't uphold the rule of law. Meanwhile, we're sending forces over potentially to assist and support Israel. And most of them have nothing opposed to that, But those forces are not there for the purpose that you mentioned at the outset, to wage war against others. They're there to support the security and survival of the Israeli state. But what Mr. Netanyahu is now doing and his supporters are doing is they're saying, look, we have an opportunity. We can leverage American military power, which is doing nothing on the border and nothing to secure the United States, and we can leverage it to our heart's content to settle accounts with everybody we don't like or who opposes us in the Middle East. That's a very dangerous picture because now we're talking about the Turks and the Iranians joining together with the various Arab states in what is coalescing into a military alliance aimed at Israel. Yes. A lot of people are concluding it probably isn't. It doesn't mean anything. So how do we get something done? How do we exert pressure? How do we drive change? And when it comes to conflicts overseas, a simple statement, do we ask people, well, what do you think? Do you think that we should fight in other people's conflicts and wars around the world unless we are attacked? And they think about that and they say, well, you're saying we haven't been attacked and we're not under threat and we're going to go fight. I said, yes. I said, well, that's wrong. Of course, it's wrong. Right? What are we doing those things for? So, it's a very common sense, logical approach, and you know, why aren't we trillions here at home to deal with the multitude of problems we have? We've lost an estimated 14 trillion over the last 20 years in these wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, frankly, also Syria and Libya. What could we have done with that 14 trillion? And look at our national sovereign debt, which now presents a real threat. So all of this is bound up together. Then when you move beyond that, you start talking about immigration. Well, don't you support immigration? Yeah, I think immigration is fine. Well, do you like what we're doing in this country? No, why don't you like it? Because we have no control over who comes in or goes out of the well. That's right. Anybody can leave, but we have no control over whomever comes in, and all of these people are showing up in and around our cities. So the cities and the states have to support them because these people aren't showing up to do jobs. Now, is that because they're lazy or don't want to work? That's not what I said. There are no jobs for them, and things get bad in this country economically and financially, and they have before. These people are in trouble because many of them will probably hold down jobs at very low wages that Americans will then need in order to survive. So what do you do with them? Well, FDR and Herbert Hoover deported something in the neighborhood, I think a total of 12 million people to Mexico. 9 million initially after the stock market crashed to open up jobs, and another 3.5 million under FDR, and subsequently another 2.5 million under Truman, and 1.5 million under Eisenhower. Those were big numbers, especially in that day. Exactly, and that was done. And what we're saying is we have to have viable police forces, viable military establishments, not woke organizations that are there to sort of satisfy someone's ridiculous notions of social engineering and social justice. Police exist to impose and enforce the law. Law is only meaningful if the police can enforce it. The same thing is true of the military. The military is only effective if it can fight. And that means it has to defend us, defend the continental United States and the American people. All of these things hang together. And that's really where we want to focus at Our Country, Our Choice. And I think it's going to work, and I think we're going to attract a lot more people. As I said, there's 80,000+ trying to get in right now, and we're having trouble keeping up on the computer. I mean, you know, we have computers like everybody else has, and well, sites are crashing. It's only going to get worse after this interview gets published, by the way. I have to apologize in advance. So, let me tell the audience then, if you go to ourcountryourchoice.com and if you have any difficulty, just wait 24 hours. Try it again. I don't know how people sign up. Is there a sign-up page? Go to the website and then click your way through it. There, it'll give you instruction. Okay. Where you go, what you want to fill out, and give us all of your information. Whatever you tell us is going to be protected. We have our own servers. We have extensive security, and just keep something in mind. This is very important. We're never going to tell anybody how to vote. That's not what we exist to do. Yes. But we are going to try to inform people about what people running for office really think and what they are likely to do. Because all of us have voted for people on the assumption, well, so-and-so's Republican. So-and-so's a Democrat. They get into office, and how do they behave? As though they're foreign agents, not representing American national interests. So we want to keep people informed. We want to encourage them to be involved in these action groups that are going to aim at very specific things like illegal human trafficking and the sexualization of children. I think it's going to work. These are early stages. We don't have all the answers. So we're receptive to other people want to tell us. Well, in fact, Colonel, if you're open to this invitation after this, please put our producer in touch with your marketing team for Our Country, Our Choice. There are a number of ways that we can help spread the word on our platform, Brighten and Brighten TV and so on. We'd love to help support that and help bring people to your cause because it seems like from what you're telling me today, it's a desperately needed common sense type of position. We have to defend what we have or we lose it. It's that simple. And we really do need unity. There's too much division in the country. There are too many people at each other's throats. So we have to focus on the things that unite us. And if you're an American citizen who cares about this country and loves this country, the things I mentioned are those things that will bind us together. Well said.